Hello and welcome to this special report at XM.com. I'm Maria Pachordes, and joining me is investment analyst Marios Hadjikyriacos. We'll be discussing the Democratic primary race and the implications for markets. So Marios, it's still early in the race, but after Iowa and New Hampshire, some candidates are clearly rising in the polls while others are struggling. How's the field looking at the moment?
Well, it's crowded, but you are right, we are seeing some candidates break away from the pack in a sense. So let's start with the frontrunner, Bernie Sanders. He's a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. He's calling for increasing taxes on corporations, for example. He's leading in national opinion polls now, and he's also leading in betting markets. He also won the second state, and he came a hair away from winning the first state. So he has a lot of momentum at this moment. Also surging in the polls is former New York mayor and the owner of Bloomberg News, Michael Bloomberg. He's a multi-billionaire, ninth richest person on the Forbes 100 list. So he has been surging in the polls even though he was a late comer to this race. And we also have Indiana mayor Pete Buttigieg rising in the polls. At the same time, we're seeing some of the more established candidates, basically their campaigns have gone into freefall, especially for former Vice President Joe Biden. He was the frontrunner for all this time, but then he had a couple of very poor performances in Iowa and New Hampshire, the first states that have already voted. And that has really, it has poured cold water on his whole argument that he's the most electable candidate. So at the same time, we're seeing Senator Elizabeth Warren slowly slipping down in opinion polls. Now, how is this going to shape out? It's still early days, but if I had to choose, I would argue that the final showdown in this race will be between Bernie Sanders and Mike Bloomberg. So Bernie has a lot of grassroots support. He has an army of supporters spread throughout the country. He has he has good fundraising out of this, and Bloomberg, even though he doesn't have grassroots support, he has immense wealth. He has been bombarding the airwaves with TV ads and so on, and we're already seeing that pay off in the sense that he's rising in the polls and in betting markets. So, yeah, I would say that we're likely to see a Sanders versus Bloomberg showdown.
Right. Now, turning to Wall Street, investors seem to be banking on a Trump re-election if Sanders wins the nomination. So health insurance stocks have gained recently, even though Sanders has promised to ban health insurance companies. What are investors basing their views on?
Well, I think that investors are thinking that, even if Sanders somehow manages to win the Democratic nomination, he will get obliterated by Trump in the general election. Now, I think they're basing that on the state of the economy. So they're looking at GDP numbers, which are quite strong, unemployment numbers, which are strong, stock markets are at all-time highs, and they're thinking, there's no way a self-described democratic socialist will dethrone a sitting president. Now, I would argue that's a flawed way of thinking. So all of this, let's say, strong GDP and unemployment numbers and record stock markets, that was the case back in 2016 when Trump got elected. And Trump really ran the message that, wages are stagnant, income inequality is extremely high, your jobs are being outsourced and so on, living expenses and healthcare expenses are soaring. So he tapped into that whole anxiety. Sanders is running a very similar message, and most of these problems haven't really been addressed by the Trump presidency. So I think it's a big mistake to write off Sanders' chances, especially because if you look at national opinion polls that have a head-to-head matchup between Sanders and Trump, Sanders consistently wins, sometimes by significant margins. The same is true for any of the top-tier Democratic candidates, to be fair. Now, I would argue that, the market may be prematurely writing off Sanders, and that might change as we go along if he continues picking up momentum.
Okay, now looking forward, do you think we might see a noticeable market hit if Sanders does well in the Super Tuesday primaries in a few weeks?
I do. So he's polling really well in the Super Tuesday states, and assuming he does as well as the polls suggest, he would be in a very strong position to win this nomination, and I think that asset managers will eventually start to take his chances more seriously. So the argument so far has been that, if Sanders gets the nomination, he will split up or divide the Democrats so much that Trump's chances are boosted. I don't agree with that. If you look at back in 2016, Trump was a very divisive candidate. Everyone was saying that he was going to split the Republicans up. But then he won the nomination and all of the party fell in line really quickly and they went on to beat Clinton. And to be honest with you, this whole situation with everyone assuming that Trump will get re-elected and that Sanders, for example, or Bloomberg have no chance, that reminds me a lot of 2016 when everyone was writing off Trump. So I'm really getting a sense of deja vu here. But as far as the market impact is concerned, if Sanders does continue doing well, I think we're going to see a more noticeable hit to healthcare stocks and energy stocks, for example.
Marius, thanks so much, and thanks for joining us at XM.com.